Dear students, our lecture today for removable partial denture is Support for Distal Extension Denture Base. The distal extension removable partial denture must depend on the residual ridge for some support, stability, and retention. Indirect retention to prevent the denture from lifting away from the residual ridge should also be incorporated in the design. The distal extension removable partial denture doesn't have the advantage of total tooth support because one or more bases are extension covering the residual ridge distal to the last abutment. It therefore is dependent on the residual ridge for a portion of its support. Now, the factors influencing the support of a distal extension base. Support from the residual ridge becomes more important as the distance from the last abutment and will depend on the following abutment. The support from the residual ridge become more important as the distance from the last abutment and will depend on the following several increases factors. Number one, contour and quality of the distal of the residual ridge. The two, extent of the residual ridge coverage by the denture base, that means the long span. Number three, type and accuracy of the impression registration. 4, accuracy of the fit of the denture base. 5, design of the removable partial denture framework. And 6, the total occlusal load applied. Now we are going to discuss each factor separately to explain these factors in proper way in relating to the removable partial denture. Now, factors influencing the support of contour and the quality of the residual ridge. The ideal residual ridge to support a denture base would consist of cortical bone that covers relatively dense cancellous bone with a broad rounded crest with high vertical slopes and is covered by a firm, dense, fibrous connective tissue. Such a residual ridge would optimally support vertical and horizontal stresses placed on it by a denture base, which came from the loading on the dental prosthesis. Easily displaceable tissue will not adequately support a denture base, and tissues that are interposed between a sharp, bony residual ridge and a denture base will not remain in a healthy state. Not only must the nature of the bone of the residual ridge be considered in developing optimum support for the denture base, but also its positional relationship to the direction of forces that will be placed on it. Now, in terms of different points regarding the followings. The crest of the bony mandibular residual ridge is most often cancellous because lining mucosa restricts both the buccal and lingual mucosa adjacent to the teeth in the mandible, as we notice in the left image in this slide. Loss of firm mucosa overlying the residual ridge is common following tooth extraction in the posterior mandible. Therefore, the crest of the mandibular residual ridge cannot be primary stress-bearing area. The buccal shelf region, bounded by the external oblique line and the crest of the alveolar ridge, seems to be better suited for a primary stress-bearing area. Now, as this seems to be better suited for a primary stress-bearing area, as a rule for this, because it is covered by the relatively firm, dense, fibrous connective tissue supported by cortical bone. The slopes of the residual ridge then would become the primary stress-bearing region for resistance of horizontal and of vertical forces. Okay? Now, the immediate crest of the bone of the maxillary residual ridge, as we notice at the image on the right side in this slide, the residual ridge of this maxillary bone structure may consist primarily of cancellous bone, unlike in the mandible. Oral tissues that overlie the maxillary residual alveolar bone are usually of a firm, dense nature, similar to the mucosa of the hard palate, or can be surgically prepared to support a denture base. The topography of the partially edentulous maxillary arch imposes a restriction on selection of a primary stress-bearing area. Of course, in spite of impression procedures, the crestal area of the residual ridge will become the primary stress-bearing area for vertically directed forces. Some resistance to these forces may be obtained by the immediate buccal and lingual slopes of the ridge. Palatal tissues, okay, as we notice at the middle, the palatal raphe area on the image on the right side, the palatal tissues between the median palatal raphe and the lingual slope of the posterior edentulous ridge are readily displaceable and cannot be considered as primary stress-bearing area, as this is the location of two bones to be sutured together. So this is not firm enough to withstand the load, but it can be act as surface area, increase the surface area for the denture base. Now, the tissues covering the crest of the maxillary residual ridge must be less displaceable than the tissues that cover palatal areas, or relief of palatal tissues must be provided in the denture bases or for palatal major connector. So the difference between the maxillary and mandibular in terms of primary and secondary stress-bearing area defined as discussed previously. Now, taking the advantage from extending of the residual ridge coverage by the denture base. Now, the border of the residual ridge, the broader the residual ridge coverage, the greater is the distribution of the load, which results in fewer loads per unit area. A denture base should cover as much of the residual ridge as possible and should be extend the maximum amount within the physiological tolerance of the limiting border structures or tissues. Now, what about the type and accuracy of the impression registration? The residual ridge may be said to have two forms, the anatomic form and the functional form. What the difference between the anatomical form and the functional form? We are going to discuss this. The anatomic form is the surface contour of the ridge when it is not supporting an occlusal load, while the functional form of the residual ridge is the surface contour of the ridge when it is supporting a functional load. The anatomic form is recorded by a soft impression material, such as a metallic oxide impression paste, if the entire impression tray is uniformly relieved, okay? So, depending on the viscosity of the particular impression material used and the rigidity of the impression tray, it is also the form that can be recorded by rubber, silicone, and hydrocolloid impression materials. Any distortion or the distortion and the tissue displacement by pressure may result from confinement of the impression material within the tray and from insufficient thickness of impression material between the tray and the tissues, as well as from the viscosity of the impression material. In terms of use the anatomic form, for example, the use of anatomic form of the residual ridge in fabricating complete denture is quite common because of the belief that this is the most physiological form for support of the denture. However, many other dentists believe that certain regions of the residual ridges in a partially edentulous patient are more capable of supporting dentures than other regions. Now, the form of the residual ridge recorded under some loading, whether by occlusal loading, that means finger loading, specially designed individual trays, or the consistency of the recording medium. It's called the functional form. This is the surface contour of the ridge when it is supporting a functional load. How much it will differ from the anatomic form will depend on the thickness and structural characteristics of the soft tissues overlaying the residual bone. It would also differ from the anatomic form in proportion to the total load applied to the denture base. Many researchers, for example, recognize that the need to record the tissues that support a distal extension removable partial denture base in their functional form or supporting state, and then relay them to the remainder of the arch by means of a secondary impression. Of course, this was called a functional impression because it recorded the ridge relation under simulated function. Another factor we are going to discuss is the accuracy of the fit of the denture base. The support of the distal extension base is enhanced by intimacy of contact of the tissue surface of the base and the tissue that covered the residual ridge. Okay? Now, the tissue surface of the denture base must optimally represent a true negative of the basal seat region of the master cast. That means all the details should be managed to be detailed precisely by the impression material. So the denture base must be relayed to the removable partial denture framework in the same manner as the basal seat tissues were related to the abutment teeth when the impression was made. And also, in terms of another factor affecting the support of distal extension is the design of the removable partial denture framework. Some rotation movement of a distal extension base at the distal abutment is inevitable under functional loading. It must be remembered that the extent to which abutments are subjected to rotational and torquing forces that result from masticatory function is directly related to the position and resistance of the foot bolus. Okay, now the greatest movement take place at the most posterior extent of the denture base. So this affect the design affected by these factors. Okay, the retromolar bud region of the mandibular residual ridge and the tuberosity region, of course, in the maxillary residual ridge, therefore are subjected to the greatest movement of the denture base. So it is possible, however, that the proximal plate minor connector adjacent to the edentulous area will not disengage from or break contact with the guiding plane. Where also the other factor affecting the support of distal extension, which is thereafter, is the total occlusal load applied. So whether the distal extension long or short, so there is a pressure on it, and this affects the support as well. So with regard to all other factors mentioned previously, we should not just and focus on the total occlusal load applied. This has an effect on the direction and magnitude of the occlusal load to the removable partial denture. And of course, this is with the distal extension denture base in case of class 2 and class 1. And thus on the load transfer to the abutments. Given this, the support from the residual ridge should be optimized and shared appropriately with the remaining natural dentition. So the support is a mucosa bone bonded design, and the natural dentition will be shared the load as well. The number of the artificial teeth as well, the width of their occlusal surfaces, and the occlusal efficiency as well, whether they are anatomical, non-anatomical, or monoplane, also influence the total occlusal load applied to the removable partial denture, which does subsequently affect the design and the torquing with the distal extension base. Coming from all these factors related to the support of distal extension, we should put in our minds that these all factors differ from case to case, whether these for maxillary and mandibular restoration. Here we are going to finish our lecture for today. So the quiz for next week will be, what are the factors that influencing the support of distal extension base in removable partial denture, of course. So thank you for today, and I'm looking forward to see you to explain the next lecture. Thank you very much.